You are at Lake Rant, where I rant about whatever my $15 a month plus patrons want me to rant about. You can get one of these by being one of those. This one is for Anime Watcher, who says, rant about the debate between Razorfist and Kyle Kulinski, and provided a link. So this is a debate that happened on the Drunken Peasants podcast, where they organized these two guys to debate each other. Kyle Kulinski, I never heard of this guy. He seems to be associated with the Young Turks, which I've also never watched, so I don't know much about it. But he's the gist of this particular debate is liberal guy versus conservative guy, more or less. Razorfist, on the other hand, I know a lot about because I follow him, and he tends to fall fairly conservative. I mean, most of his videos he tends to fall on the side of the conservative talking points, but he is more of a libertarian guy. It's more that in this current space, I guess, there are more conservatives who agree with the things that he feels. It's just like I wouldn't really call him just a flat-out conservative guy, but that tends to be where his values align with. So that's kind of what's going on here. And, Drunken Peasants itself is sort of more of a somewhat more conservative podcast. It's hard to say because, what you might consider liberal or conservative depends on who you are, but disclosure, I am somewhat biased as somebody who watches Razorfist videos, and even though I am by no means a conservative, I do think his perspective is really interesting, and he raises lots of good points in his videos. It's a great way for me to get a sense of what that side is about, like what they're thinking, why the decisions are made that they make. So, it's not that I agree with Razorfist all the time, but I think he's a really interesting and just a great speaker. He also has tons of videos that have nothing to do with politics that are also highly entertaining, and he has a big vocabulary that I enjoy listening to. I've also been a guest on the Drunken Peasants podcast before, even though I've never actually listened to it outside of the episode I was on. But whatever, that's your disclosure. So going into this, it's funny because I was worried that what I was about to watch was Razorfist getting blown the fuck out. I was like, uh-oh, I hope this isn't going to be, the debate that makes me go, oh, Razorfist, you dumb bastard, or whatever. But actually, what surprised me a lot, because, the tone of Razorfist's rant videos and his political videos is very aggressive. In a comedic way, he's constantly just, slamming insults and jokes at the people he talks about, but in a tongue-in-cheek, rapid-fire approach. And so, I wasn't sure what it was going to be like when he gets into this debate, but funnily enough, he ended up being the mild-mannered and reasonable one, whereas the other guy is, right off the bat, very aggressive in a way that I found really needless and made it really hard to listen to him, made it very difficult to watch. I watched half of this debate, by the way. I did not end up watching the whole thing because it's 2 fucking hours long, and I found it insufferable. But, the actual arguments going on in this, they start off with defining what each of them thinks a liberal or conservative is. And I thought that this was an interesting and sort of telling part of the debate, because when you're defining these two groups, there's basically 2 ways you can go about it. You can go about it holistically and look at everybody who identifies with that group and say, here's what they seem to be. Or you can boil down the core ideology that is at the heart of everybody in that group and say, this is what it is. Because if we were to say that conservatism is a blanket of everybody who identifies with the party, everything they believe is conservatism, there's going to be a lot of, what's the word I'm looking for? Contradiction in the party. There's going to be people who believe different things, and so to blanket call the whole thing that, for either party, for that matter, I'm just using this as the example, it ignores the fact that so many of those people disagree with each other. And the other way you can go about it is to say, well, if they're all on the same side, there must be some core elements that they all agree with. So it felt like Razorfist presented that angle, where he was saying, he was trying to identify each group by the set of more core beliefs, and I felt was fair to both groups. He, it even said that more of his beliefs tend to align with classic ideas of liberalism as a libertarian than a lot of conservative values, in spite of the fact that the current state of the Conservative Party aligns with his values better. Whereas Kyle was more addressing it as like, well, here's who's in the party, so this is what the party is. Throwing a lot of shade at the Conservative Party, essentially, or the Republican Party, I guess. Just basically saying that they're backwards thinkers and a lot of social, in a lot of, what's the word I want to fucking use? Social issues. So, I thought that while that could be true, it's a much more vague and unfair portrayal of the party as a whole, because obviously even if some people who are conservative have those, backwards, as he calls them, beliefs, it doesn't represent the party as a whole. And nonetheless, I still think it's fair to say, like, okay, well, if more of the conservatives feel this way, then it might be a party you don't want in power if, like, a lot of them are people who are backwards. But it also does nothing to address the fact that somebody like Razorfist, who does not agree with a lot of those backwards ideologies, still identifies with the party because they ultimately represent the things he does care about over the other party. Which is why I enjoy watching him, because of the fact that he's not a conservative, certainly not a hardline one. He's, even if he votes along that party line, it doesn't mean that he agrees with everything the party says, and he's been very openly, critical of the party when they do things he doesn't personally agree with, particularly candidates like John McCain, who he absolutely hates. So that kind of difference in approach, I felt, characterized a lot of the debates that were going on, where the Kyle guy, it's like he seems to be more of a, like, party lines kind of guy. Like, here's what the conservatives are like, and here's why they're wrong, and the liberals are the opposite, whereas I didn't get that impression from the way Razorfist argues. Now, on to the actual topics that they were debating. It's really difficult for me to come away from it feeling like either one of them really made a good point, because they are making good points for their side, but they're not addressing the whole of the issue. And this is basically my problem with all politics, and especially all political debates, is that you can easily talk past the other side's points to address something else, because these issues are so multifaceted. So, for instance, on the subject of, what was the first one they debated? They were talking about, universal health care. So, Kyle was saying that countries with universal health care are more satisfied with their health care, there is more coverage, better coverage, more people get treated. Razorfist was arguing, as is usually the counter-argument, that the extremely long wait times for care can cause a lot of problems for people, and if there is no ability to have privatized healthcare, then you run into these kinds of problems. So this is something I've seen presented a lot of times, both sides of this argument. The problem is that neither one of them is addressing that they are both true, that both things are true to some extent. The question is, how true are they, and which one matters more? So, Razorfist tells this anecdote about how Stefan Molyneux, who I guess, lives in Canada, had a tumor in his neck that they had told him was benign and put him on a long waiting list, because the way that the socialized medicine works, as Kyle was pointing out, is that they prioritize you based on the importance of the severity of your condition. So it's less likely that you're going to, die waiting for your appointment, because they're they're basing it on how important it is, deciding where you end up in the line. But Razorfist was, in his anecdote, was talking about how Stefan Molyneux had this thing identified as benign, so he was put on a super long wait. He eventually, after like 9 months, comes to America to just get it taken care of, and finds out it was not benign, and that he possibly would have died had he waited the entire time. So this is a good story about a problem with socialized healthcare. However, it's just one story. The question is, what is the sum total of all of this? What is the total number of deaths that happen this way? What is the total number of incidents of things fucking up? How long are the waits for different conditions? Like, if we had all the data, it would not be that difficult to decide which one is a better system. And ultimately, I mean, I would say, in my opinion, a better system is what a lot of the Democrats right now are proposing, which is to have the option of Medicare for all, but also you can have private health care if you want. I think that it just makes sense to have both ways. Why not? Which is why it's always confused me that like Bernie Sanders argues for not having it both ways and only having the socialized medicine, which is, I don't know if that's just to force doctors to participate. Like maybe there won't be enough doctors in the socialized field of the medicine if too many of them want to work in the private sector. But I think there'd be plenty of doctors who'd be motivated by their desire to help people, who and the shit work environment that the healthcare industry is for a lot of doctors. Again, Yang talks about all this in his book. I'll just defer to that. But I just felt like both of them were not really addressing the issue because, Kyle is saying, oh, well, those are anecdotes or data points that don't indicate the whole. And I'm like, well, then bring in all the data. I just felt myself saying citation needed a lot watching this debate, especially when they would get into some really broad sweeping statements. Like, again, Kyle just saying like, Republicans are like, the majority of them are backwards on social issues. Like, well, how do you fucking prove that? Like, where's the statistic on that? Like, how do we categorize what is or isn't backwards? Who is or isn't believing in that, and what percentage of the party feels that way? So there ends up being a lot of talking past each other, as tends to happen in these debates, and just a refusal to kind of acknowledge the fact that both sides are right to some extent. It's just a matter of who is more right, and you can't figure that out without having the data in front of you. So, these kinds of debates, they can be interesting, but to me, it was like, yeah, this is just all the shit I've heard from both sides. Like, yeah, you're just both representing exactly what your side tends to think on this issue, and then arguing over who's right without any proof. There is no, here's the evidence that you're wrong. There might be little pieces of evidence, little anecdotes, little pieces of ideas, but none of it is conclusive. None of it has enough data behind it to say, yeah, this is actually wrong, or this is actually right. And it's not that neither of them's bringing in data. They are bringing in data. It's just not holistic. And, it's baffling to me that this is how all these debates go. It feels like people basically do enough research to prove their side right, but not enough research to prove the other side wrong. And that's kind of where I came away feeling in this. It's like, yeah, both of you are making valid points, but who's wrong? You can't determine that without more information, So overall, I came away not really feeling like I had learned anything at all, other than that Kyle Kulinski is a fucking douchebag, and not because of any of his beliefs, just the way he communicates and the constant need to laugh or interrupt or down talk whatever Razorfist was saying for basically no reason. Other than that's the way a lot of people are. It's similar to Destiny in that way, whereas Razorfist was just kind of, just making his points and not really attacking or anything, not trying to call the other guy an idiot for believing what he believes. So, yeah, it was annoying, but nonetheless, I did not come out really thinking either side was more correct than the other.